Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through actually the completing of the book of Joshua tonight. And the last three chapters really are kind of one block. Chapter 19 begins with an incident, and then the next couple of chapters really kind of deal with the fallout. And it's the closeout of the book, but clearly by some of the people that are mentioned as we go through it, not at the very beginning of chapter 19, but in the next chapter. There are people that are mentioned in here that make it very, very clear that this event was really pretty amazing and pretty disgusting, actually, what had taken place here. But it happened during a time shortly after Joshua's death. So though it is at the end of the book of Judges, the events must have taken place after the death of Joshua, but not too terribly long thereafter because of the people mentioned. What you take away from this, once again, the warring that would have taken place between the people that are involved here and the various tribes, it just shows you how quickly things can go from what should have been victorious and wonderful to a time when it was just as wicked and vile as it could have ever been. And again, when you read the details of it, perhaps some of you are familiar with it, but it's just such a tragic situation when you read this. I don't know how else to describe it other than it gives you kind of a pit in your stomach of how awful it is when God's people had taken their eyes off of him, and the things that they were capable of were just so unbelievably evil. And you can see why this really kind of led to so much of the horrible things that happened during the time of the judges. This happened at the front end of it. So this is coming out of the book of Joshua and into the time of the judges. But again, as you'll see, this is pretty early on. So this shows you that the debauchery and the way that things were being done is nothing like it was when they first came out of Egypt. And it just shows how quickly, within just a couple of generations, things can absolutely devolve into some of the most ungodly, wicked, and horrible, evil things. So it's really instructive to us to just say, when you even begin to see that kind of compromise in any of our lives, that it's not that you just continue in that direction, but it's to come to the Word of God and make sure that you have a good understanding of what He would advise us to do and what He would show us through the Word, and then to be obedient to it, because this is just wickedness like it's almost unimaginable. So chapter 19 is where we pick up. Let's have a word of prayer and let's look at the text. Father, we thank you as we gather in this place that we are able to study your word and that you're able to minister to us and to give us instruction. We would ask, Lord, that you would open our eyes to this. And again, as we read this part of the history, how grievous it is, as it should be to us as we read these things, but that we might also see the very real danger of what happens when we stop keeping our focus on you and begin to see the way that compromise just eats away at the life of the believer. And people even of great promise are able to fall into all kinds of horrible things if they excuse sin. So we ask, Lord, that you would again speak through your word and that you would instruct us through it. And we ask it in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 19 begins this way. It says, "Now it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel, that a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah." Now, once again, this is the idea that there was no king in place. Usually this also is followed up that everybody did what was right in their own eyes. This is before the time of the kings, clearly after Joshua. So this is that time again of the judges. And so the things that were taking place already were so far outside the law, things that should never have taken place. And so even the taking of concubines and Levites and the whole thing is already gone. This gives you an idea how quickly it devolved. In verse 2 it says, "Now his concubine played the harlot against him." Now this, of course, there was the commitment basically with a concubine. It was almost like the commitment of a marriage, and yet at this point she had gone and kind of prostituted herself or played the harlot, involved with someone else. This carried a death sentence, and yet you'll see what he does here. So he went away, and went away from him. She played the harlot, went away from him to her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah. and was there for 4 whole months. Then her husband arose, went after her to speak kindly to her, and brought her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. And so he brought them to her father's house. And when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to meet him. And now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him and stayed with him for 3 days. And so they ate and they drank and they lodged there. Now you can see that the father doesn't really want to let his daughter go, hoping that this holding him back would deter him or some reason. He has some ulterior motive of wanting to do this. In verse 4, so now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed there for 3 days and ate and drank and lodged. In verse 5, it says, "And it came to pass on the 4th day that they arose in the morning and stood to depart, but the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, Refresh your heart with a morsel of bread, and afterward go your way. And so they sat down, the two of them ate and they drank together. Then the young woman's father said to the man, Please be content to stay all night, and let your heart be merry." So this gets to be this pattern. It's getting a little bit later. Why don't you just stay? There's no reason to rush off, but it's been days now. So verse 7, "And when the man stood to depart, his father-in-law urged him, so he stayed there again. He arose early in the morning on the 5th day to depart. But the young woman's father said, Please refresh your heart. And so they delayed until afternoon, and both of them ate. And when the man stood to depart, he and his concubine and his servant, his father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, Look, the day is now drawing toward evening. Please spend the night. See the day that is coming to an end. Lodge here, and let your heart be merry. Tomorrow go your way early, so that you may get home." So again, this is the repeating pattern. Now we're days into this whole thing, and this is like it's starting to wear a little bit. Well, anyhow, it doesn't give us a whole lot more details, and I just kind of read through it. There's really not much in the way of commentary, but there had been a delay to this point. All right. However, the man was not willing to spend that night, and so he arose. He departed, and he came opposite to Jebus, that is Jerusalem. So this gives you an idea of the area where it is. So if it's from Bethlehem, just a little bit to the north and a little bit to the west is where you would see Jebus or Jerusalem. So he didn't get very far. And if he's going to the mountains of Ephraim, he's got to pass through the tribe of Benjamin's area, and then he'd start to get into the area where he is. So he's still not very far, but it's just like, I've got to get out of that place. Got to get away from the father-in-law. Now, what I'll probably do at some point is maybe put up a map of this, and actually now would be a good time. I'll go ahead and put this up, and then you can screen grab it if you want to, or take a look at it, because it'll kind of help with understanding where some of these cities are, and it gives you kind of an idea of where all of the locations are, because it's going to, over the next couple of chapters, a lot of places are going to be mentioned that you may not be familiar with. You've probably heard the names of them, but this will help you with getting familiar with where exactly they are. Now, verse 10 says, "However, the man was not willing to spend the night. He arose, departed, and then he came to Jebus, or that is Jerusalem. With him were his 2 saddled donkeys. His concubine was with him as well. So they were near Jebus, and the day was far spent. And the servant said to his master, Come, please let us turn aside into the city of the Jebusites and lodge with them." Now, the idea that there are Jebusites there gives you a great indication of just how messed up things were. Because the fact that there are children of Israel in the land, and there were also Jebusites this close, I mean, we're talking about Jerusalem here. If we remember, coming out of Joshua, and coming into Joshua's time rather, the Jebusites put up such a great battle, or such a great resistance. They weren't able to get rid of them. That's what was said. They weren't able, they couldn't overcome them. And that just basically shows it was a failure on the children of Israel's part, because had they done as God had instructed them, and had they sought him to be the one who would root out the Jebusites, they wouldn't be there. But you can see the infiltration of the wickedness and the pagan culture that you had among the Jebusites, because the things that are about to take place would not be allowed in any small measure under the law. The fact that these things could be taking place in the open would never have been tolerated. So with that being the case, we remember from reading through Joshua that Benjamin just was willing to have the Jebusites live among them, and the more years that would go by, the more the corruption became thorough among the children of Israel there. So the master said to him, verse 12, "We will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners who are not of the children of Israel, but we will go to Gibeah." And so they said to to his servant, "Come and let us draw near to one of these places, and we will spend the night in Gibeah or in Ramah." Now, here's the funny thing about it, interesting part. The Jebusites would be bad enough, but notice how the religious order of things would be. The Jebusites are too wicked. We don't want to go into one of their places. So instead, they go among the people of Benjamin. And then we see what happens in Benjamin, how wicked it had gotten there. So the idea of wanting to separate themselves from the Jebusites and stay among the Benjamites, the only thing is one group were of the sons of Jacob and the other ones were not. But as far as the immorality and the vile things that would take place, it was indistinguishable. That just shows you the corruption that had taken place and how wicked it was. So in verse 14, and so they passed by, they went their way, and the sun went down upon them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. So the tribe turned aside, so they turned aside there to go in and lodge in Gibeah. And when they went in, they sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into his house to spend the night. They couldn't find lodging. Nobody was offering. And so they're staying basically in the town center. Well, in verse 16, just then an old man came in from his work in the field at evening, who also was from the mountains of Ephraim, and he was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. So he sees countrymen, how he's able to recognize them. It doesn't go into all of that, but he sees them staying out in the open. That gives you an idea. The guy says, not a good idea. Well, this is among the brethren. Amazing. So he went to him, and he said, "We are passing from Bethlehem to Judah toward the remote mountains of Ephraim. I am from there. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I am going to the house of the Lord. But there is no one who will take me into his house." House of the Lord is Bethel. So Bethel would be just to the north, again, of Jerusalem. That gives you an idea of the area that we're talking about here. So it says, "Although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself, for your female servant, and for your young man who is your servant, there is no lack of anything." And so the old man said, "Peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the open square." And so he brought him into his house and gave fodder to the donkeys, and they washed their feet, and they ate and drank. And so this was the wager. Look, we're all from the same place, so I've got enough provisions here for my own things, and then for you as well, just as a way of saying thank you for taking us in. And the guy said, I'll take care of it. Not even looking for anything else, just bring them in. Don't stay out here in the square. Well, we get an idea, I think, pretty quickly here, why the man was not only wanting to be hospitable, but he saw that there was the potential for some real awful things to take place, which did anyway. So as they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. Then they spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know them carnally." Now, that gives you, this sounds so reminiscent of the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing. And there are some that would, of course, the people that are the liberals when it comes to the Bible, and Bible liberals, if you would say that this is just a story that didn't really happen. It's just taken as kind of a plagiarism of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. They would even question the whole Sodom and Gomorrah story. But they're saying that, see, this similarity, it's the same thing. The men wanted to know who the angels were in Sodom and Gomorrah. Here it's the travelers that were coming through that had been in the open square. Now I think we get an idea why this other man had said, it's best not that you not stay out here. So, of course, they came and they asked, and you'll see, again, very similar to Sodom and Gomorrah and the whole deal with Lot. It's, I'll offer them something else. Now, see, again, we're referred to here as perverted men. But the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, "No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage." Now, clearly, we're talking about men of the city looking for the other men that were travelers. So clearly, we're talking about the perversion that had taken place and made its way into this part of Israel. Again, this is Benjamin. Just amazing. So here's one of the things that we have to recognize. This kind of, as it's referred to as perversion, clearly we can see who the participants would have been, but the idea of this kind of intimacy, even of if it was of women with men that were not married, that's so far outside of the law. This is a complete perversion to the point where this is punishable by death. If we read Leviticus, the idea of man being involved with man homosexually is something that is worthy of death for people that are under the law. Now, it is important that we recognize it too. When it comes to our understanding of it, God's opinion didn't change, but these were for people that were under the law. So for the Christian, we don't say that the death penalty should be imposed for homosexuality. They're not people who are under the law. They'll stand before God someday, judged for whatever has gone on in their life. That would just be one of many things, as all of us will stand before God judged someday. The question is whether or not Jesus has paid for the price of your sin and whether you've accepted his forgiveness and the offering that was made by him for your sin. So again, this just shows the moral depravity of things. And it had taken place even among the people in Benjamin. So this man pleads, don't let this be done. So the man, the master of the house, don't let this be done, this wickedness, don't let this outrage take place, verse 23. So look at this. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now, humble them, do with them as you please, but to this man do not do such a vile thing. So again, this just shows it's not a vile thing to offer up a virgin daughter and this man's concubine. That just shows the position of women. It shows the moral compromise, and that anything that these men would want to do, being that they are the quote perverted men, they shouldn't be given anything. Now, of course, I'm sure he's concerned about violence. This is trying to preserve himself, but this is just a great commentary on how absolutely wicked and vile the whole thing had become. Well, so the men would not heed him, and so the man took his concubine and brought her out to them, and they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And when the day began to break, they let her go. And the woman came as the day was dawning, fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, until it was daylight, until the light came up. And when her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house, he went out to go his way, and there was his concubine fallen at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, "Get up and let us be going," but there was no answer. So the man lifted her onto his donkey, and the man got up and went to his place. So what we find out, clearly this woman dies of the abuse that took place. So it doesn't take any kind of imagination. It requires no commentary whatsoever how absolutely insanely wicked this is. And again, they didn't want to go stay with the Jebusites because, well, they're the heathens. This happened in Benjamin. This happened among the children of Israel, among the tribes. And this is what took place. Think about this. This is shortly after Joshua's death, not too long thereafter, again, because we're about to find out the people who were there to oversee what was going to be done about this. And what is done with this woman's body is, again, the cruelty of it, the inhumanity of it. It's the kind of thing that you expect of the godless, the people who have no clue about a God of righteousness and justice. And yet here's the children of Israel, who should know that better than anyone, had completely fallen apart to this point not long after Joshua. Let that sink in. You have the Exodus, you have the time of Moses, the time of Joshua, leading them into the land to subdue the land. They get to the place where they're able to occupy the land, but they don't remove all of the inhabitants of the land. And so all of that corruption makes its way in. They quit following the law, which is what God told them they must do if they wanted his favor, and this is what happens. Just a case in point of what happens when you ignore the things that God says. Look at verse 29. So when they had entered his house, he took a knife, laid hold of the concubine, divided her into 12 pieces limb by limb, and sent her throughout the territory of Israel. And so it was that all who saw it said, no such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up. So he basically divides her up into these 12 pieces, cuts her up into 12 pieces as a testimony to say, what's going on here? Now, the idea that he had a concubine and that all these things had taken place and that she was still alive when she had gone and committed harlotry, that was a death sentence in itself. So, some would say, well, she got what she deserved. No, nobody should have that go on with them. But nobody in this has their hands clean. And yet some people look at it and then they're appalled because she's cut up into pieces. And 12 of them is to signify of the 12 tribes. This is going on among us. All right, well, again, nobody had their hands clean, but there are some parts of this where clearly are much worse than the offenses of others. So look at what the next couple of chapters are going to deal with. How do they handle everything with Benjamin, with the tribe of Benjamin, because it's happened there in their territory, and then what was to come of them going forward. Now again, remember, there will be hundreds of years of the times of the judges. So this happening at the front end, it doesn't get better. This just shows you how wicked it was. Chapter 20 says, so all the children of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba. So that tells you that everybody saw. That means the north to the south. That's everything of the southern tribes, Judah down to Simeon, and they were intermingled there, all the way up into Dan, who had gone to Laish, which is now called the city of Dan. And so that's from north to south. That's just a way of saying from top to bottom of all of the inhabited tribal areas, they all found about this. And they, as well as the land of Gilead. And so the congregation gathered as one man before the Lord at Mizpah. Now we're going to find that they take an oath here at Mizpah, and that's going to play into the next chapter. So the leaders of all the people, all the tribes of Israel, they presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. Now the children of Benjamin heard that the children of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. Then the children of Israel said, tell us, how did this wicked deed happen? So the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, my concubine and I went into Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin, to spend the night. And the men of Gibeah arose against me, surrounded the house, and began around the house because of me. They intended to kill me, but instead they ravished my concubine so that she died. Now, what he says here that they wanted to kill him, we don't understand exactly how they had planned to go about it. Was it going to be that we've already heard that they're perverted people. So it's a little unclear for sure if they wanted to do the same kind of things to him that they were going to do to her. There's no reason for just kind of indiscriminate violence necessarily. It sure seems like that was the intention, was to do vile things. Well, so I took hold of my concubine, cut her into pieces, sent her throughout the territory of all of the inheritance of Israel, because they committed lewdness and an outrage in Israel. Look, all of you are children of Israel. Give your advice and counsel here and now. So what are you guys going to do about this? So all we're doing is trying to get back home. We try to stop in what would be friendly confines, Benjamin, and this happens. Here's the episode. What do you guys want to do about it? We're all gathered here before the Lord. Now what's to be done? So all the people arose as one man, saying, none of us will go to his tent, nor will any of us turn back to his house. But now this is the thing which we will do to Gibeah. inside of Benjamin, Gibeah, we will go up with them against it by lot. We will take 10 men out of every 100 throughout all of the tribes of Israel, 100 out of every 1,000, and 1,000 out of every 10,000 to make provisions for the people, that when they come to Gibeah in Benjamin, that they may repay all the vileness that they have done in Israel. Now, it's an interesting thing. Let's read verse 11. So all the men of Israel were gathered against the city, united together as one man. Now, let's remember, from other things that we see, none of these other guys had their act together. Nobody was walking as they should rightly before the Lord. This was just something that had become so high profile that it had to be answered. And so what you'll notice is that God is not really necessarily with this whole thing, because they're making all of these decisions, but you'll notice there's not a whole lot of let's consult the Lord on this. Instead, they get together and they work it out. What should we do as an answer to this? Back in the day, if you remember what it was like under Moses and Joshua, there was a direct line of communication, God to a mediator, Moses, then Joshua. There was one person. That's no longer the case. There's not a judge, or not a judge. There's not a person like Moses. Joshua is gone. There isn't anybody that's a focal point. Even the kings, we see what a bad idea that was, because when we compare all of the kings, there were only a handful of them that were worth anything. Most of them were just really bad, wicked people. Well, as we go on through this, so the tribes of Israel sent men throughout all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, "What is this wickedness that has occurred among you? Now therefore deliver up the men, the perverted men, who are in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and remove this evil from Israel." That part's good. That part would be the law. So it is, you guys have brought this wickedness among our people. Now deliver those guys up. We need to know who was responsible. Bring them to us. They need to be put to death for their crimes, the things that they have done. Well, verse 14, instead the children of Benjamin gathered together from their cities in Gibeah, or to Gibeah, and they went to go out to battle against the children of Israel. And from their cities at that time, the children of Benjamin numbered 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who numbered 700 select men. Now, among all the people were 700 select men who were left-handed, and everyone who could sling a stone at a hair's breadth and not miss. So these were guys who had the ability to use both hands for battle. They're just very well-trained guys. So if you can wield a sword with one hand and throw a stone the idea of the breadth of a hair and not miss, that's just a way of saying whatever you're throwing at, you're going to hit. They're that skilled. It's just a way of saying how skilled they were. So among all the people, rather, there were these guys, verse 16, now verse 17. Now besides Benjamin, the men of Israel numbered 400,000 men who drew the sword, all of whom were men of war. So the odds are just ridiculous. There's no way this should even be a battle. It also shows the arrogance of Benjamin when you see that much arrayed against you, and the fact that they're willing to do this should let you know that this is not something that should even happen. Let's step back a moment. This is the children of Israel. The fact that they have gone to war against one another over this incident just shows you how much they've turned their back on the Lord. And yet, in some of this dialogue, you find the back and forth about they honor God with their mouths, but clearly the lives and the lives of the nation had gone a long ways astray. Well, in verse 18, the children of Israel arose and went up to the house of God, Bethel, to inquire of God, and they said, "Which of us shall go up first to battle against the children of Benjamin?" And the Lord said, "Judah first." Now, interesting. Notice this. It's an important thing. They don't go and say, "Is there anything that you would have us to know, Lord? Do you want us to go?" Now, there seems to be, Benjamin's going to be judged for this, but there does seem to be some judgment that God allows to fall upon the other nation, the other parts here, because they didn't do what they're supposed to do. So the other tribes, they have some things that God's going to make them learn the hard way that they should correct. And so they ask, but they don't ask all the right things. They don't make an offering. They don't make sure that they are clean of anything. And so God just answers the question, who should go up first? He has sent he has sent Judah before. It's kind of a repeat of that whole thing. But you'll notice that God doesn't say anything about, I approve this, I disapprove this. He doesn't give them any battle plans. Who's going to go up first? Joshua. Or not Joshua, but Judah. Let Judah go up first. Okay. So the children of Israel rose in the morning, encamped against Gibeah. The men of Israel went out to battle against Benjamin, and the men of Israel put themselves in battle array to fight against them at Gibeah. And so the children of Benjamin came out to Gibeah, and on that day they cut down to the ground 22,000 men of the Israelites. And the people, that is, the men of Israel, encouraged themselves and again formed in a battle line at that place where they had put themselves in array that first day. And the children of Israel went up and they wept before the Lord until the evening. They asked counsel of the Lord, saying, shall I again draw near for battle against the children of my brother Benjamin? And the Lord said, go up against him. Now, once again, there is still none of that recognition of their own things needing to be right. They went and they cried out, but notice that there's elements missing here. It's not, we've suffered defeat. Lord, is there something that we should have learned? Remember, they could very easily have gone back and said, we've got that problem with Ai that happened with Joshua. I wonder if there's something going on here. We shouldn't have any problems overcoming Benjamin. We've got him outnumbered, more than 10-1. So there's no reason why we should be defeated here. There's something going on, and they don't get to that point. They get far along enough where they come to the Lord and they're crying out and everything else, but God allows them to go up again, and they're going to again learn the hard way. Well, so the children of Israel, they went up and they wept before the Lord in the evening. They asked counsel of the Lord, saying, shall I again draw near for battle? Now, that's their only counsel. Rather, is there anything else that we should know? Had they asked that, it would have worked out much differently. So, verse 24, the children of Israel approached the city of Benjamin on the second day. Benjamin went out against them from Gibeah on the second day, cut down to the ground 18,000 more of the children of Israel, all who drew the sword. So how is this happening? They're losing people by the tens of thousands, and it doesn't tell us that the ranks of the Benjamites have been thinned at all. What this also shows us is that we can see that God has a problem with what Benjamin did without question. He's also got a problem with the other children of Israel because of any number of other things that they've done, but even the idea that they're going up against their own brothers, God's going to want to judge that, but he's not going to want to use them to judge the brothers if their hands aren't clean. So there's clearly stuff that they've got going on. Well, we're about to find out what would be the right formula, if you will. So all the children of Israel, that is all the people, they went up and they came to the house of the Lord. And they wept, they sat there before the Lord, and they fasted that day until the evening. They offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. So the children of Israel then inquired of the Lord. The Ark of the Covenant of God was there in those days. And then notice the people who were here. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, stood before it in those days, saying, shall I again go up to battle against the children of my brother Benjamin? Or shall I cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into your hand. Do you see the difference in this? The difference was their attitude coming before the Lord, having things in the right and proper way, and then after that, making their offerings, fasting, seeking the Lord, and then saying, should we go or should we stay back? You'll see the order of this changed heavily, but look at how many people's lives were damaged before God could even use them to go after Benjamin. That's what helps us to understand how out of control the whole nation had become. And so we read in verse 29, then Israel set men in ambush around Gibeah. Now, this is a totally different approach, clearly. And the children of Israel went up against the children of Benjamin on the third day, put themselves in battle array against Gibeah as in the other times. And so the children of Benjamin went out against the people, were drawn away from the city. They began to strike down and kill some of the people, as at the other times, in the highways. One of those which goes up from Bethel to the other to Gibeah. And in the field there was about 30 men of Israel. So the children of Benjamin said, "They are defeated before us as at the first." But the children of Israel said, "Let us flee and draw them away from the city to the highways." And so all the men of Israel rose from that place, put themselves in battle array at Baal Tamar. And Israel's men laid in ambush, burst forth from their positions into the plain of Gibeah. And 10,000 select men from all Israel came against Gibeah, and the battle was fierce. But the Benjamites did not know that disaster was upon them. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and the children of Israel destroyed that day 25,100 Benjamites, all these who drew the sword. Now, before I read any more, consider this, how wrong this whole scenario is. That here, this is brother killing brother. But it would have never gotten to this point had they been walking rightly and in fellowship with God. The events wouldn't have happened. There would be war against the brothers. None of this should have happened. It never should have gotten anywhere near this point. But again, because they didn't cleanse the land like they were supposed to, that corruption made its way in to a people who were apparently willing to be corrupted, because they no longer sought God the way that they should. So even when something like this came up, the idea of how they should approach going to war, this is early on, remember, in the time of the judges, they are not at all prepared for the world that awaits them. They're not walking rightly before the Lord. And look at how many people had to die, tens of thousands, before they finally did the right things. Fasted, sought the Lord, made peace offerings, then inquired of the Lord. The priests were involved. There was the proper order of things before taking a step. So sad that so much calamity had to happen before they sought to do this the right way. Well, the children of Benjamin saw that they were defeated. The men of Israel had given ground to the Benjamites because they relied upon the men in ambush whom they had set against Gibeah. The men in ambush quickly rushed upon Gibeah. The men in ambush spread out and struck the whole city with the edge of the sword. Now, the appointed signal between the men of Israel and the men of ambush was that they would make a great cloud of smoke rise up from the city, whereupon the men of Israel would turn in battle. Now, Benjamin had begun to strike and kill about 30 of the men of Israel, for they said, "Surely they are defeated before us as at the first battle." But when the cloud began to rise from the city in a column of smoke, the Benjamites looked behind them, and there was the whole city going up in smoke to heaven. And when the men of Israel turned back, the men of Benjamin panicked, for they saw that disaster had come upon them, and therefore they turned their backs before the men of Israel in the direction of the wilderness. But the battle overtook them, and whoever came out of the cities they destroyed in their midst. They surrounded the Benjamites, chased them, and easily trampled them down as far as the front of Gibeah towards the east, and 18,000 men of Benjamin fell. Now this is almost depleting the entirety of their ranks. All these men of valor, and they had turned and they had fled toward the wilderness of the rock of Rimmon, and they cut down 5,000 of them on the highways. They pushed them relentlessly up to Gibbon, and these are all, it's amazing when you look at the map, all of these places are so close together. We're talking about being driven a few miles in any of these directions from Jerusalem. This is just kind of moving its way north and west from kind of town to town. It's all very close to Jerusalem. So, all who fell in Benjamin that day were 25,000 men who drew the sword. All these were men of valor. But 600 men turned, fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and they stayed at the rock of Rimmon for 4 months. And the men of Israel turned back against the children of Benjamin. They struck them down with the edge of the sword from every city, man and beast, all who were found. They also set fire to the cities that they came to. Okay, great. So Benjamin is defeated, but for a handful of people. Now, again, this is like real devastation and destruction to the point where it imperils the very survival and existence of one of the entire tribes of Israel. So some things, again, God has judged Benjamin, but he has not approved necessarily of the children of Israel but just to a point. He's given them victory because what Benjamin had done was so wicked and they would not police their own people. But look at how many people in Israel had to fall before they finally got it together. But now they realize we've created another problem entirely. What's going to be done for the future of the tribe of Benjamin, because we've wiped out all these people. And they're about to take an oath that's going to make it even more difficult. And then their solution is just so unbelievably wicked. Well, in chapter 21, we get this. Now, the men of Israel had sworn an oath when they were at Mizpah, that they said, none of us shall give his daughter to Benjamin as a wife. So the men of Benjamin are so wicked, we will never, because we're so disgusted by what they did at Gibeah, we'll never let our daughters intermarry with any of the men of Benjamin. Okay, great. But you just wiped out most of everything that could continue on the line of Benjamin. Because what you have left, all the men are gone for the most part. You have the old men and the young men, but you've got nobody there to do much of anything of bringing on the next, the next generation. Well, here's what happens. Now, when the people came to the house of the Lord, they remained there before God until evening. They lifted up their voices and they wept bitterly. And they said, O Lord God of Israel, why has this come to pass in Israel that today there should be one tribe missing from all of Israel? They really need to ask this question. I mean, is it really not obvious to them? Should be. I mean, obviously they know it's more one of those questions about how did it come to this? Well, again, a little introspection might not be a bad thing here because wickedness had overrun the country, and that's why it took place. So it was on the next morning that the people rose early, built an altar there, offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and the children of Israel said, who is there among all the tribes of Israel who did not come up from the assembly of the Lord? For they had made a great oath concerning anyone who had not come up to the Lord at Mizpah, and said, they will surely be put to death. And so the children of Israel grieved for Benjamin their brother, and they said, one tribe is cut off from Israel today, because they won't allow intermarriage. The tribe is going to be wiped out here. What shall we do for the wives of those who remain, seeing that they have sworn to the Lord that they will not give their daughters to be wives? So what's going to have to take place? Now, they've already asked the question, so of the people that should have sent delegations to us for this war, who is there that's left that hasn't gone? Well, so they said, what one is there of the tribes of Israel who did not come up to Mizpah to the Lord? And in fact, no one had come from the camp of Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. And when the people were counted, indeed, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead were there. Again, you can take a look on the map. And so the congregation sent out their 12,000 of their most valiant men, commanded them, saying, go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, including the women and the children. And this is the thing that you will do. You shall utterly destroy every male and every woman who has not known a man intimately. So here's one of their remedies. We've made this deal at Mizpah that we will never allow our daughters to be a part of it. Now, is there any group of people that did not send people to come and to go to war with us? And they said, well, yeah, Jabesh Gilead didn't do it. Great. Go kill everybody there except for the virgins. We'll send them as the daughters because they were not a part of this taking of the oath. You see the deal making that's going on here? We got to figure something out, or Benjamin's going to be gone. Now they start to rely upon their own reasoning and their own wisdom. So it tells us, so they send out these 12,000 men, verse 10, and verse 12 says, so they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man intimately, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. And again, Shiloh's real close by in this proximity, again, looking at the map. Then the whole congregation sent word to the children of Benjamin who were at the rock of Rimmon and announced peace to them. So there's got to be some men left over. We've got to begin to repopulate Benjamin or he's gone. So it's just amazing. This, again, makes you just realize it's not that the guys in Benjamin, it's not that the guys who survived that managed to get away were good guys, but it was like, this is the best of all options. It doesn't say that these were guys who got out of the fight because they were somehow decent moral men. They're not anything that would give that indication. They were ready to go to war over this. Now they've found a way to get 400 women, and it's still not going to be enough. There's 600 guys there, 400 women, and they've depleted basically the whole tribe. Well, then verse 13, the whole congregation sent word to the children of Benjamin who were at the rock of Rimmon, and they announced peace to them. So Benjamin came back at that time, and they gave them the women who they had saved alive from the women of Jabesh Gilead, and yet they had found not enough for them. So we've still got a shortage of women. Now look at what they do after that. It's just like, you've got to be kidding me. So the people grieved for Benjamin because the Lord had made a void in the tribes of Israel. The Lord had done that. Okay. Why? Because God said, go judge them? Their blood is on their own hands, and even the people who God used to judge are just also stuck in all kinds of wickedness, because look at the things that they do and how dishonest it all is, but they're able to say, we won't violate our oath, we're just going to violate the spirit of it, is what they're going to do. So verse 16 tells us, so the elders of the congregation said, what shall we do for wives, for those who remain, since the women of Benjamin have been destroyed? And so they said, there must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe may not be destroyed from Israel. However, we cannot give them wives from our daughters, for the children of Israel have sworn an oath, saying, cursed be the one who gives a wife to Benjamin. Now, again, there's nothing that tells us that God said to put that in place. That was something that they did on their own, because they were so appalled at what had taken place. But what we can see in just about this entire instance is that God's on the outside looking in. He's there if they're willing to cry out to him and do the proper things to gain, first of all, to deal with their own sin and come before him clean and right, and then he's able to speak to them. Instead, they pay him lip service, they get wiped out, and after that number of exchanges, finally he says, I'll deliver them into your hand. Why? Because they fasted. They really sought him. They did what they were supposed to of making offerings. They got to the high priest. What do? Do we go forward? Do we turn back? They finally got it together, but they realized the consequences of this. And now there's this problem. Now you're going to see that they go right back to not seeing what would you have us to do? So no sooner does God give them all the victory, then they go back to their old ways. They go back to their same failed way of doing things. So verse 19 says, they said, in fact, there is a yearly feast to the Lord in Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east side of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem and south of Lebanon. Now, therefore, they instructed the children of Benjamin. Now, they said, now go lie in wait in the vineyards and watch. And just when the daughters of Shiloh come out to perform their dances, it's a celebration that takes place, then come out from the vineyards, every man catch a wife for himself of the daughters of Shiloh, and then go to the land of Benjamin. And then it shall be, when the fathers of their brothers, or their brothers rather, come to us to complain, then we will say to them, be kind to them for our sakes, because we did not take a wife from any of them in war, For it is not as though you have given the women to them at the time, making yourselves guilty of the oath. Basically, it's, guys, we don't want to see Benjamin wiped out, but here's a way that you can still preserve your oath, but let them have your daughters. So it's a workaround. Just amazing how sickening this is. We can let them steal your daughters, and then you won't have to say you broke your oath because you didn't give them your daughter. But this way, Benjamin can go ahead and continue to be a tribe. Look at all the back dealing of this. It's just so unbelievably wicked. So the children of Benjamin did so, took enough wives for their own number, and for those who danced, whom they caught. And then they went and returned to their inheritance, and they rebuilt the cities, and they dwelt in them. And so the children of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his own tribe and family. They went out from there, every man to his inheritance. And in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, verse 25 is a great way of looking at this. There was no governance. Now, governance for the sake of governance is not a good thing anyway. If it's wicked governance, if it's a wicked king, so what? It just means that the people will be wicked, and so will the government. But if we think of a king or someone who would oversee them and govern them in the way like what Moses or Joshua represented to them, it would have been somewhat of a different case, because those were men who were careful about the things of the Lord. Clearly, that was already starting to fall apart in the very early days after Joshua's death. And it led to this kind of just wicked, wicked stuff that was going on. The takeaway from this, and what everyone should learn, God has been really, really clear on what it is to take, or what it is to do to walk rightly before Him. He's given it to us in the text. It's easy for us to see. The question is it one of our lives? Is it one of rebellion? Or is it one that we will do as He's instructed for us to do? How do you walk rightly before Him? How is it that you manage to deal with matters of sin? Those are all incredibly important matters here. So we can see what happens when they do it wrong. This is a great case study in it, and it happened early in the time, shortly after Joshua's death. Didn't take long. So, eyes on Jesus, making sure that we do those things that are pleasing to God. He's given us His word that we know how to walk rightly before Him. The question is one of obedience. We see what happens to an entire nation when they should know better and don't follow. Let that be instructive to us. So that closes the book of Judges. We have the book of Ruth to get through. We have that. We'll start that next week. And then we'll move on through Samuel and then through the Kings. So with that being said, hope that you get a chance to look this over again. I know we went through a lot of text, but it's not a very complex story necessarily. It just is more instructive in the application sense. So if you have any questions about this, as always, I love to have you write to us, and you can do so through the email. And if you have any things on the topical side, I've been getting some requests to do some topics in our talking points. We always love that kind of back and forth. We'd love to take on some of those. We've had a pretty busy schedule with a number of other things of late, so I haven't been able to put out as many as I'd like to lately, but we're going to get back on doing those here real soon. And again, if you find topics that you would like to see addressed, just drop us an email and we'd appreciate that. So until next week, God bless you.